The first torpedo struck shortly after 2 in the morning. It tore into the side of an American landing ship filled with soldiers, trucks, fuel, and ammunition. The explosion ripped through the darkness. Fire spread across the deck. Men were thrown from their bunks. Others woke to the sound of alarms screaming and metal breaking apart beneath their feet. But for a few terrifying moments, some of the soldiers did not understand what was happening. They had been told this was a training exercise. Everything around them was supposed to be part of a rehearsal for D-Day. The ships, the weapons, the darkness, and the simulated enemy fire were all designed to prepare them for the invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe. But the flames were real, the torpedoes were real, and somewhere beyond the burning ships, German fast attack boats were preparing to strike again. The American convoy was moving slowly through Lyme Bay, just off the southern coast of England. Its ships were carrying men who would soon land on Utah Beach in Normandy. Instead, they had sailed directly into one of the deadliest training disasters in United States military history. Within minutes, heavily loaded landing ships became burning traps. Soldiers jumped into freezing water. Some were pulled beneath the surface by their own equipment. Others remained in the sea for hours, waiting for rescue while the cold slowly took away their ability to move. By sunrise, hundreds of Americans were dead. The official death toll would eventually reach 749 servicemen. That was more American lives than would be lost during the actual assault on Utah Beach several weeks later. And yet, most Americans would hear almost nothing about it. The survivors were ordered not to speak. The dead were removed under conditions of strict military secrecy. Families received devastating news without being told the full story. The operation was called Exercise Tiger. It was supposed to prevent disaster on D-Day. Instead, it became a disaster of its own. In late 1943, the Allies were preparing for the largest amphibious invasion in history. Operation Overlord would require thousands of ships, aircraft, vehicles, and landing craft to cross the English Channel. More importantly, it would require enormous numbers of young men to perform tasks that many of them had never attempted under real enemy fire. There could be no ordinary rehearsal for something this large. The troops assigned to Utah Beach needed a training area that looked and behaved like the coast of Normandy. Allied planners found what they needed at Slapton Sands on the southern coast of Devon, England. The resemblance was remarkable. Slapton had a long gravel beach. Behind it was a narrow strip of land, followed by a body of water called Slapton Lay. The geography closely resembled the area behind Utah Beach. If American troops could practice landing there, commanders believed they would be better prepared for what awaited them in France. But transforming the English coastline into a secret battlefield required a major sacrifice from the people who lived there. Approximately 3,000 local residents were ordered to leave their homes. Families abandoned villages where some had lived for generations. Farms, houses, and roads were placed under military control. The entire region became a restricted training ground. American troops began rehearsing landings, unloading vehicles, establishing beachheads, and coordinating movements between ships and units on shore. Exercise Tiger would be the largest and most realistic rehearsal of them all. Beginning in late April of 1944, tens of thousands of troops would participate in a full-scale simulation. They would load their vehicles onto landing ships, sail through Lyme Bay, approach Slapton Sands, and storm the beach as if it were Normandy. The exercise was designed to reproduce the confusion of battle. Naval guns would bombard the coastline. Soldiers would hear explosions around them. Live ammunition would be used in carefully controlled areas. General Dwight Eisenhower believed the men needed exposure to the noise, fear, and disorder they would experience in combat. The intention was understandable. But when thousands of men, multiple commands, live ammunition, changing schedules, and different radio systems were placed inside one enormous exercise, a single misunderstanding could become deadly. And Exercise Tiger would suffer from far more than one. Even before the German attack, Exercise Tiger was beginning to go wrong. On the morning of April 27th, troops were scheduled to land at Slapton Sands after a naval bombardment. The explosions were supposed to prepare the beach and make the exercise feel like a real invasion. The original landing time was 7:30 in the morning, but several landing ships were delayed. To give them time to arrive, the commander moved the landing back by 1 hour. The naval bombardment was also adjusted to the new schedule. The change did not reach everyone. Some landing craft continued toward the beach according to the original timetable. Reports from the exercise described confusion and casualties involving live fire. The exact scale of this incident remains disputed, and some later accounts may have exaggerated it, but the warning was unmistakable. Communications were failing inside an exercise built around precise timing, yet there was no time to stop. The next phase involved Convoy T-4, a group of 8 American tank landing ships. These vessels were known as LSTs. They were large, slow ships designed to carry troops, trucks, armored vehicles, fuel, and supplies directly onto a beach. Their broad doors could open at the bow, allowing vehicles to drive onto land. This made them essential for the coming invasion. It also made them vulnerable. An LST was not built to race away from an attacker. Fully loaded, it moved slowly. Its cargo could include gasoline, ammunition, and vehicles packed closely together. A torpedo striking the wrong location could create an inferno. The convoy would sail a long route through Lyme Bay to simulate the crossing of the English Channel. Then it would approach Slapton Sands for the landing. The ships were expected to have naval protection, but one of the British escort vessels assigned to the convoy, the destroyer HMS Scimitar, had suffered damage in a collision and returned to port. A replacement was sent, but it arrived too late to join the convoy. Only one escort vessel, the corvette HM Azalea, remained with the 8 American landing ships. There was another problem. The British escort and the American LSTs were not operating on the same radio frequency. Important warnings could be transmitted nearby without ever reaching the men who needed them most. The convoy entered the darkness in a slow line. Across the channel, German naval forces were already moving. The German vessels approaching Lyme Bay were known to the Allies as E-boats. The Germans called them Schnellboot, or fast boats. They were almost the opposite of the heavily loaded American landing ships. E-boats were narrow, fast, maneuverable, and built to attack suddenly with torpedoes before disappearing into the darkness. Operating from Cherbourg on the French coast, they regularly crossed the English Channel in search of Allied shipping. During the night of April 27th and 28th, a group of German E-boats moved into Lyme Bay. Increased Allied radar traffic had drawn German attention to the area. British naval stations detected the danger. Warnings were transmitted. But because of communication failures and incompatible radio frequencies, the American landing ships did not receive a clear picture of what was approaching. The convoy continued forward. Its 8 ships were ranged in a line, one behind another, stretching across miles of dark water. They were moving slowly and were not zigzagging. To a German torpedo boat commander, they presented an extraordinary target. The men aboard the LSTs had little reason to believe they were about to enter combat. They were near the coast of England, not Normandy. Many were asleep below deck. Others were preparing equipment for the morning landing. Vehicles had been secured inside the ships. Soldiers carried heavy packs and wore life belts around their waists. The atmosphere may have been tense, but it was the tension of rehearsal. Then, shapes appeared in the darkness. Some witnesses initially mistook the German boats for friendly vessels connected to the exercise. Even when gunfire began, confusion remained. The entire operation had been designed to expose the soldiers to realistic battle conditions. How could they know which explosions were simulated and which were trying to kill them? The German boats moved rapidly around the convoy. Their small silhouettes were difficult to identify against the black surface of the sea. At approximately 2:03 in the morning, a torpedo struck LST-507. The explosion ripped into the ship and ignited gasoline carried aboard. In an instant, the training exercise became a real naval battle. Men who had expected to practice landing on a quiet English beach were now trapped inside a burning ship, under attack by an enemy they had never expected to encounter. The impact on LST-507 was devastating. Fire spread rapidly through sections of the ship. Gasoline and burning debris transformed passageways into deadly obstacles. Smoke filled enclosed spaces. The electrical system failed, leaving men struggling through darkness illuminated only by flames. Those sleeping below deck had to wake, understand the situation, find an escape route, and reach the open air before fire or water trapped them inside. There was no orderly evacuation. Some soldiers climbed toward the deck, wearing little more than the clothes of which they had been sleeping. Others carried equipment because training had taught them never to abandon it. Men searched for friends in the smoke while officers tried to restore control. The ship began to list. Vehicles and equipment shifted. Ammunition exploded in the heat. Burning fuel spread across the surface of the sea, turning the water around the ship into another threat. The order came to abandon the vessel. For many men, jumping into the sea seemed like the only chance of survival. But the water in Lime Bay was bitterly cold. A person entering it could lose strength rapidly, especially while wearing boots, clothing, and heavy military equipment. Many troops had been issued inflatable life belts rather than modern life jackets. The belts were supposed to be worn high under the arms, but some soldiers wore them around their waists. When they entered the water, carrying heavy packs, the buoyancy around the waist could force the upper body downward. Instead of keeping a man's head above the surface, the life belt could turn him onto his back, or even leave him struggling upside down. Men who survived the explosion drowned within sight of the ships. Others clung to debris as the cold took effect. Their muscles weakened. Their hands stopped responding. Voices calling through the darkness slowly disappeared. Crewmen aboard other ships attempted to return fire, but identifying the fast German boats was extremely difficult. At least one American landing ship was reportedly struck by friendly gunfire during the confusion. LST-507 remained burning as survivors fought to escape, but the German attack was not finished. The E-boats moved through the convoy again, searching for another target. Ahead of them was LST-531, crowded with soldiers and equipment. When the next torpedoes arrived, that ship would have even less time to survive. LST-531 was struck by 2 torpedoes. The damage was catastrophic. The ship began sinking so quickly that many of the men below deck never had a realistic chance to escape. According to accounts of the disaster, the vessel went down in approximately 6 minutes. 6 minutes was all the men had to wake, find a passage through a damaged ship, reach the deck, and jump into freezing water. There was no time to launch an organized rescue. Some soldiers were killed by the explosions. Others were trapped inside compartments as the sea rushed in. Heavy vehicles broke free from their restraints. Equipment and debris blocked escape routes. Those who reached the deck found panic around them. The ship was disappearing beneath their feet. Men jumped from the sides. Some landed on others already in the water. Some were injured by floating wreckage. Many entered the sea carrying far too much weight. Darkness made everything worse. A soldier in the water could hear voices but could not see where they were coming from. He might swim toward what he believed was a rescue ship, only to discover burning wreckage. Oil and gasoline covered portions of the surface. The wakes of moving vessels pushed survivors apart. The danger also created a terrible problem for the remaining ships. Stopping immediately could make them easier targets. Turning through an area filled with survivors risked crushing the men in the water. Continuing forward meant leaving Americans behind in the freezing sea. The German E-boats had achieved what their speed and surprise were designed to accomplish. They had struck the slow convoy, created chaos, and withdrawn before the Allies could organize an effective response. LST-289 was also hit, but remained afloat and eventually reached port despite severe damage. Other vessels scattered or continued toward safety. Behind them, the sea was filled with wreckage and men calling for help. The casualties aboard LST-531 were enormous. Hundreds died with the ship or in the water around it. Entire groups of soldiers who had trained together disappeared in a matter of minutes. These men had been preparing to face German defenses on the beaches of France. Instead, they died off the coast of England during an exercise that was supposed to teach them how to survive. After the German boats withdrew, the immediate attack was over. But for the men in the water, the battle for survival had only begun. The sea temperature was cold enough to produce hypothermia. Even strong swimmers could not remain effective for long. Heavy clothing absorbed water. Boots made movement difficult. Packs and equipment pulled men downward. Survivors tried to stay together. Some held onto pieces of wreckage. Others found life rafts or floating equipment. Men supported injured comrades even as their own strength disappeared. Rescue did not come quickly enough for many of them. Ships arriving in the area faced a horrifying scene. Bodies and survivors were scattered across the water, sometimes making it difficult to distinguish between them in the darkness. Small rescue craft, which might have recovered men more safely, were not immediately available in sufficient numbers. Some larger vessels lowered nets or ropes along their sides. But a freezing and exhausted soldier could reach a ship and still be unable to climb aboard. Accounts from survivors describe men losing their grip only feet from safety. Others died from burns or injuries sustained in the explosions. Medical facilities on shore suddenly had to receive casualties from an attack that almost no one had expected. By daylight, the scale of the disaster became visible. 2 American landing ships had been sunk. Another had been badly damaged. The water was filled with debris from vehicles, military equipment, and personal belongings. The human cost was staggering. The most widely accepted official figure is 749 American dead. Of these, 551 were members of the United States Army, and 198 were members of the United States Navy. The attack had killed more Americans than the assault on Utah Beach would kill on D-Day. And this had happened before the invasion had even begun. Military leaders now faced several urgent questions. How had German boats reached a convoy participating in one of the most important rehearsals of the war? Why had warnings failed to reach the American ships? Why had the convoy been left with only one escort? And perhaps most frightening of all, had any of the missing officers been captured alive? Some of the men aboard the ships knew highly classified details about Operation Overlord. If Germany had taken even one of them prisoner, the greatest invasion plan of the war could be in danger. News of the attack reached the highest levels of Allied command. General Dwight Eisenhower was furious. The disaster had exposed failures in escort protection, convoy movement, communications, and rescue preparation. It had also created a threat far greater than the loss of ships. Several officers missing after the attack possessed what was known as B-82 clearance. This gave them access to highly classified information about the Normandy invasion. They knew details connected to the landing areas and operational plans. Allied commanders had to determine whether these officers were dead, missing in the water, or captured by the Germans. If an E-boat had recovered one of them alive, that prisoner could reveal that an enormous amphibious invasion was approaching. Information about the rehearsal might also help the Germans identify Utah Beach as one of the intended targets. The bodies of the missing officers had to be located. Only after all of them were accounted for could commanders be confident that the invasion plan had not fallen into enemy hands. The Germans, meanwhile, had attacked what appeared to be an unusually valuable convoy, but there is no evidence that they understood the full significance of Exercise Tiger or recognized it as a rehearsal for the coming invasion. Operation Overlord remained secure. For the survivors, however, another kind of silence began. They were ordered not to discuss what had happened. The secrecy was not initially intended to erase the dead from history. The Allies were preparing to invade occupied Europe in only a few weeks. Any public report about a disaster involving American landing forces could reveal information useful to Germany. It could also damage morale at the worst possible moment. Families in the United States were notified that their sons or husbands had died, but many received few details. Some were told only that the death had occurred somewhere in the European theater. The men who survived returned to their units carrying memories they could not share. Some would soon board landing ships again. This time, the destination would be France. They had watched ships burn. They had seen friends disappear in freezing water. And now they were expected to participate in the operation that Exercise Tiger had been created to prepare them for. But the catastrophe had exposed weaknesses that could still be corrected. The dead of Exercise Tiger would influence the preparations for D-Day, even if almost no one outside the military knew their story. Exercise Tiger revealed how quickly a major amphibious operation could collapse when communication failed. The Allies responded. Radio frequencies were standardized so that American landing ships and British escorts could exchange warnings more reliably. Procedures for convoy protection were reviewed. Troops received better instruction on how to wear their life-saving equipment correctly. Commanders also recognized the need for small rescue craft capable of pulling survivors from the water. These changes could not undo what had happened in Lime Bay, but they could reduce the chance that the same mistakes would be repeated during the invasion. On June 6, 1944, the Allies launched Operation Overlord. American forces approached Utah Beach under real German fire. Naval guns bombarded enemy positions. Landing craft carried soldiers through rough water. Confusion remained unavoidable, and some units landed far from their intended positions. But the assault succeeded. Utah Beach became one of the most successful Allied landing areas of D-Day. American troops moved inland, established a beachhead, and began connecting with airborne forces that had landed during the night. The losses were real, but they were far lower than many planners had feared. It is impossible to calculate exactly how many lives were saved by lessons learned during Exercise Tiger. Military history rarely provides such simple answers. But the disaster forced commanders to confront weaknesses before those same weaknesses appeared during the invasion itself. There is also an important distinction between secrecy and a permanent cover-up. The attack was kept secret before D-Day for clear operational reasons. Details and casualty figures were released later in 1944, and accounts appeared after the war. Yet the story never entered public memory in the way that Pearl Harbor, Normandy, or the Battle of the Bulge did. For decades, many families still knew little about how their relatives had died. The tragedy received limited attention. Records were incomplete, some documentation had been lost with the ships, and confusion over casualty figures continued. Exercise Tiger was not completely erased. It was overshadowed. The men died only weeks before one of the most important events of the 20th century. Once D-Day began, the world's attention moved to Normandy and the liberation of Europe. The rehearsal that had ended in flames became a footnote beneath the history it had helped prepare. Years after the war, the coast near Slapton Sands still carried traces of what had happened. Wreckage remained beneath the water. Local residents remembered the secret military activity, the wounded arriving on shore, and the bodies recovered from the sea. One man, a local hotel owner named Ken Small, became determined to preserve the story. After discovering military debris along the beach, he spent years researching Exercise Tiger and speaking about the Americans who had died there. His efforts helped recover a Sherman tank from the water near Slapton Sands. Today, that tank stands as a memorial. It does not represent a famous victory. It marks a rehearsal that went terribly wrong. Exercise Tiger is a story about enemy action, but it is also about vulnerability. The German E-boats were effective because they found a slow convoy at precisely the moment when Allied protection and communication had failed. It is a story about the difference between preparing for war and controlling it. Commanders had created a realistic exercise to prevent panic on D-Day, but reality entered the exercise in a way no plan had anticipated. Soldiers who believed they were safe suddenly faced fire, sinking ships, and freezing water. 749 American servicemen died. Many never reached the beaches they had trained to assault. They never saw the Allied foothold in Normandy or the liberation that followed. Their last battle took place in darkness, off the coast of a friendly country, during an operation the world was not allowed to know about. But their deaths were not meaningless. The failures exposed during Exercise Tiger led to changes. The survivors carried brutal experience into the invasion, and the disaster became one more hidden price paid before the first American soldier stepped onto Utah Beach. D-Day is remembered as the moment the liberation of Western Europe began. But before that morning, there was another night, a night when young Americans boarded ships for a training exercise and encountered a real enemy. A night when the rehearsal became the battle, and a night when hundreds of forgotten men died preparing history for what came next. If you want more forgotten war stories that sound impossible but really happened, subscribe and follow us.